Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening where mysteries unfold like winter roses blooming in moonlight. Tonight, we journey together into a tale of wonder and gentle intrigue, a story designed to ease your restless thoughts and guide you softly toward peaceful sleep. Let the world outside fade away. Let the demands of tomorrow dissolve like snowflakes on warm window panes. Here, in this space between waking and dreaming, we shall explore a mystery most peculiar, one that visited Baker Street on a Christmas Eve long ago, when London lay wrapped in frost and the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. I invite you now to settle deeply into your comfort, wherever you may be. Adjust your pillows, pull your blankets close, let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the weight of your body sinking gently into the surface beneath you. Tonight, you need do nothing but listen and perhaps, eventually, drift away entirely. The story will continue whether you hear every word or not, a river of words flowing steadily through the darkness, carrying you toward rest. Now, breathe with me, in slowly, deeply, filling your lungs with calm, out gently, releasing all tension, and again, in with peace, out with worry. Perfect. We are ready to begin. London, December the 24th, 1891. Evening has descended upon the great city like a velvet curtain drawn across an ancient stage. Snow has been falling since morning, soft and persistent, muffling the usual cacophony of the streets into something resembling a whispered lullaby. The gas lamps along Baker Street glow like earthbound stars, their light fractured and softened by the endless descent of white crystals, each flake catching and releasing luminescence as it spirals downward through the frozen air. Inside number 221B, the sitting room radiates warmth and sanctuary from the winter beyond its walls. The fireplace crackles with cherry logs, their sweet smoke mingling with the familiar scents of pipe tobacco, old leather, and the particular mustiness of ancient books whose pages have absorbed decades of London fog. The flames dance and sway, casting liquid shadows that climb the wallpapered walls and pool in corners, creating a space that feels both intimate and infinite. A pocket of coziness carved from the cold immensity of the winter night. Sherlock Holmes reclines in his customary armchair, positioned precisely to receive maximum warmth from the hearth, while maintaining clear sight of both door and window. His long fingers are steepled beneath his sharp chin, grey eyes fixed upon the flames. With that peculiar intensity he reserves for problems yet unsolved. He has been motionless for the better part of an hour, a statue carved from contemplation, while beyond the frost-etched windows, London prepares for Christmas with a festive bustle that seems, tonight, to bypass Baker Street entirely. Dr. John Watson sits opposite, a medical journal open across his lap, though he has not turned a page in some considerable time. Instead, he finds himself watching his friend with that mixture of concern and fascination that has characterized so many of their evenings together. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks with hypnotic regularity, each sound soft and precise, marking time with the patience of something that has nothing but time to mark. Watson finally clears his throat gently, a small sound that barely disturbs the room's profound quiet. "Holmes," he ventures, his voice warm and measured. "You have been uncommonly still this evening. Surely even you must admit the approaching holiday demands some concession to festivity." Holmes's lips curve into the ghost of a smile, though his gaze remains fixed upon the flames. "Festivity, Watson, is merely society's agreed-upon fiction that winter can be made less dark through collective pretense and excessive consumption of poultry. His voice is low and musical, each word emerging slowly, deliberately, as though he speaks from within a dream. However, I confess the season has its compensations. The criminal classes, it seems, also observe these holidays. London's underworld has grown remarkably quiet. Perhaps, Watson suggests gently, that quietness is precisely what troubles you. Too much peace for a mind accustomed to puzzles? Before Holmes can reply, a sound interrupts the room's tranquil atmosphere. Not the sharp knock one might expect on such an evening, but rather a tentative scraping, as though someone outside the door hesitates, uncertain whether to announce themselves or flee. The sound comes again, more insistent now, accompanied by what might be heavy breathing, or perhaps merely wind forcing itself through gaps in the building's ancient framework. Holmes rises fluidly from his chair, all previous stillness transformed into graceful motion. He exchanges a single glance with Watson, an entire conversation conducted in silence, before crossing to the door. His hand rests briefly on the brass knob, and in that moment the building seems to hold its breath. Even the fire ceases its crackling, as though all of Baker Street pauses to witness what comes next. The door swings inward, admitting a gust of cold air that sends the flames leaping, and the shadows dancing wildly across every surface. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the gaslit landing, is a figure so extraordinary that even Holmes, accustomed to the unusual, pauses for the briefest moment before stepping aside to allow entry. The visitor is a woman, though that word seems insufficient to capture the presence she brings into the room. She wears a travelling cloak heavy with snow, the fabric so saturated with moisture it drips steadily onto Mrs. Hudson's carefully maintained floor. Beneath the hood, her face is pale as moonlight on marble, her eyes wide and dark with either terror or wonder, perhaps both indistinguishable. She clutches something to her chest, wrapped in what appears to be a gentleman's evening scarf, the bundle held with such fierce protectiveness that her knuckles have gone white. "Mr. Holmes," she whispers, and her voice carries the particular quality of someone who has been running through cold air, breathless and urgent, yet somehow musical. "They said you were the only one who might believe me, the only one who could help." Watson has risen now, his medical instincts propelling him forward with chair and offer of assistance. Holmes guides the woman gently to the seat nearest the fire, while Watson pours brandy from the crystal decanter, the amber liquid catching firelight as it flows. The woman accepts the glass with trembling hands, but does not drink, her attention fixed entirely upon Holmes, who has returned to his chair and now regards her with that intense, focused attention that transforms his entire countenance. "You have travelled some distance this evening," Holmes observes quietly, his tone conveying neither question nor judgment, merely statement of observed fact. "Your boots, though of excellent quality, carry mud of a particular reddish hue, found primarily in the suburbs north of Hampstead. The snow upon your cloak has melted and refrozen several times, suggesting hours of exposure rather than minutes. And you carry something you believe to be of vital importance, something you fear others might wish to take from you." The woman nods slowly, and a single tear traces down her pale cheek, catching firelight as it falls. "I came as quickly as I dared," she breathes. "I did not know whom else to trust. The police, they would never understand." they would think me mad, or worse, they would believe me, and that belief would lead to consequences too terrible to contemplate. She pauses, and in that pause, the room seems to lean closer, the very walls appearing to bend inward, as though buildings too can be curious. Outside, the snow continues its patient descent, and somewhere distant, church bells begin their call to midnight service, their sound soft and mournful through the white curtains of falling flakes. Before you drift deeper into sleep, I wonder, dear listener, might you share in the comments what time it is for you now, and where in this wide world you are listening from? The woman slowly, reverently, begins to unwrap the bundle she has guarded so fiercely. The fabric falls away in soft folds, revealing what at first appears to be merely a piece of parchment, aged and brittle, its edges curled with and brittle, its edges curled with time and handling. Yet, as the firelight plays across its surface, Watson perceives something remarkable, something that draws him forward despite himself. The parchment is covered in symbols, intricate drawings that seem to shift and dance in the flickering illumination. Neither quite writing nor quite illustration, but something suspended beautifully between both. Holmes leans forward with the deliberate slowness of a hawk focusing upon distant prey, his grey eyes narrowing as they trace each line and curve. He does not reach for the document immediately, but rather allows his gaze to consume it completely, memorizing every detail before physical contact might disturb its secrets. The woman watches him with desperate hope illuminating her pale features, her breathing gradually steadying now that she has found sanctuary, however temporary. "Tell me," Holmes murmurs, his voice barely rising above the fire's gentle crackling, "how this came into your possession. Omit no detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem. The smallest thread often unravels the largest tapestry." The woman draws a shaking breath, clasping her hands together as though in prayer. "My name is Eleanor Ashford," she begins, her words emerging slowly, carefully, as one might cross a frozen river, testing each step. "I am employed as archivist at the British Museum in the Department of Obscure Manuscripts and Ethnographic Curiosities. 3 weeks ago, a collection arrived from an estate sale in Belgravia. The deceased was Lord Pemberton, an explorer and naturalist who spent much of his later years investigating folklore and mythological creatures throughout the empire." She pauses, accepting the brandy glass once more, this time bringing it to her lips and sipping with visible relief. The liquid seems to restore some colour to her cheeks, some steadiness to her voice. Watson settles into his chair, medical journal forgotten entirely, his attention completely captured by the unfolding narrative. "Among Lord Pemberton's effects," Eleanor continues, "were dozens of journals, sketches, specimens preserved in alcohol, and this." She gestures toward the parchment, with reverence bordering on fear. "At first, I thought it merely another curiosity, perhaps a map to some legendary location, the sort of romantic nonsense gentlemen explorers collect like butterflies. But as I studied it, as I began to decipher the notation along its margins, I realized this was something altogether different, something dangerous." Holmes has now taken the parchment delicately between his long fingers, holding it close to the firelight, his eyes moving with practiced efficiency across every inch of its surface. "The symbols are Tibetan," he observes quietly, "but corrupted, altered, as though someone attempted to transliterate sounds from a language that predates written records. And here, along this edge, chemical staining suggesting the document has been exposed to extreme cold, the particular crystalline pattern indicating altitude and atmospheric moisture, consistent with mountain ranges above 12,000 feet. Watson finds himself marvelling, not for the first time, at his friend's encyclopedic knowledge. The way Holmes can extract entire narratives from physical evidence others would dismiss as meaningless damage. Eleanor nods eagerly, leaning forward. Yes, precisely. Lord Pemberton's journals describe an expedition to the Himalayas in 1879, where he heard persistent stories from village elders about creatures dwelling in the highest peaks. Not the common myths known to everyone, but something specific, something the locals spoke of with genuine terror. They called them the Migu, though that word itself is merely approximation, a human attempt to echo a sound not meant for human vocal cords. The fire suddenly shifts, a log settling with a shower of sparks that dance upward like orange stars seeking their celestial home. The light changes, deepening the shadows in the room's corners, making the space feel simultaneously more intimate and more vast, as though Baker Street's walls have expanded to contain all the wild spaces of the world Eleanor describes. Lord Pemberton, she continues, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, claimed to have seen one, not merely glimpsed from a distance, but encountered face to face during a snowstorm that separated him from his expedition party. He described it as massive, standing perhaps 8 feet tall, covered in thick white fur that rendered it nearly invisible against the snow. But it was the eyes he could not forget, he wrote, the terrible intelligence in those eyes, an awareness that suggested these creatures possessed consciousness equal to, or perhaps exceeding, our own. Watson shifts uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath his weight. Surely, he ventures gently, such stories are merely the product of altitude sickness, oxygen deprivation, the mind creating phantoms from exhaustion and snow blindness. Holmes raises one long finger, requesting silence, his attention still completely fixed upon the parchment. What Watson means to suggest, he says softly, is that we must approach such claims with rational skepticism. However, I have learned through bitter experience never to dismiss testimony simply because it challenges conventional understanding. The universe, Watson, is considerably stranger than our philosophies typically allow. Eleanor's hands twist together in her lap, anxiety returning to her features. You must understand, I thought the same initially. I catalogued Pemberton's materials as interesting folklore, nothing more. But then, 4 days ago, something happened that transformed academic curiosity into genuine fear. She pauses, and in that pause, Holmes finally sets down the parchment, giving Eleanor his complete, undivided attention. Even the fire seems to quiet, as though the flames themselves wish to hear what comes next. I was working late in the museum archives. Eleanor breathes, her eyes distant now, seeing not Baker Street, but some darker, colder place. The building was closed to the public, only a few guards making their rounds through the endless galleries. I had spread Pemberton's documents across my desk, attempting to construct a timeline of his Himalayan expedition. The gas lamps were turned low to preserve my failing eyesight, and outside the high windows, snow had begun falling, just as it falls tonight. She reaches for her brandy glass again, but her hands shake so violently that Watson gently takes it from her, holding it to her lips while she drinks. The gesture is tender, paternal, and seems to give her strength to continue. I heard breathing, she whispers. Not my own, not the guards on their distant rounds, but something else, something large and present, as though a great beast had somehow entered that sealed room without opening any door. The temperature dropped so suddenly, I could see my breath forming clouds in the lamplight. And then I smelled it. A scent unlike anything I had encountered before, wild and ancient, like glaciers and high storms and places where humans have never walked. Holmes's grey eyes have gone very still, very focused, in a way Watson recognizes as indicating his friend's complete absorption in a problem. "You saw nothing?" he asks quietly. "I dared not turn around," Eleanor admits, and her voice breaks slightly. "I felt certain that if I looked directly at whatever stood behind me, something terrible would occur. Instead, I gathered the parchment, the most vital of Pemberton's journals, and I ran, simply ran through those echoing marble halls until I reached the street, where falling snow and gaslight restored some semblance of normal reality." The clock on the mantelpiece chimes once, marking the half-hour, its tone clear and pure as crystal, in the weighted silence that follows Eleanor's confession. Holmes rises slowly, moving to the window, where he parts the heavy curtains to gaze out at the snow-draped street below. "And you believe," he says softly, not turning from his contemplation of the winter night, "that something followed you from the Himalayas, that whatever Lord Pemberton encountered in those far mountains has somehow found its way to London, drawn perhaps by this parchment, by knowledge it does not wish humans to possess." "I know how it sounds," Eleanor whispers desperately. "I am a rational woman, Mr. Holmes, educated in science and skepticism. Yet I cannot deny what I experienced, and more, I cannot ignore what I discovered in Pemberton's final journal entry, written just days before his death last month." Holmes turns back to face her, his angular profile sharp against the snow-bright window. "And what did that entry contain?" Eleanor's voice drops to barely audible, forcing both men to lean forward to catch her words. A warning. He wrote that he had made a terrible mistake, that by documenting what he had seen, by attempting to prove the existence of these creatures to the scientific community, he had violated some ancient covenant. He believed they were coming for him, travelling south from their mountain home to silence him forever. His final words were these: "If I am found dead, let no one seek revenge or further investigation. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some borders are not meant to be crossed." Holmes remains at the window for a long moment, his silhouette motionless against the pale luminescence of snow-reflected gaslight. When he finally speaks, his voice carries a quality Watson has learned to recognize over their years of partnership, a particular tone that suggests his extraordinary mind has already begun constructing theories from fragments, weaving possibility into probability with threads invisible to ordinary observation. "Death came to Lord Pemberton in what manner?" Holmes asks, still gazing into the winter night. Behind him, Eleanor and Watson wait, the fire painting their faces in shades of amber and shadow, the room holding its breath. "The official verdict was heart failure," Eleanor replies, her voice steadier now, as though speaking to Holmes's back, rather than his penetrating gaze, makes confession easier. "He was found in his study at his Belgravia residence, seated at his desk, his face composed, as though he had simply fallen asleep while working. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of violence. The physician who examined him noted only that Lord Pemberton's expression, while peaceful, held a quality he described as unusual. A wideness about the eyes, he said, as though the deceased had witnessed something that surprised him profoundly in his final moment. Holmes turns from the window at last, moving with that peculiar grace he possesses, each gesture economical and precise. He returns to the parchment, lifting it once more to study by firelight, his long fingers tracing symbols without quite touching the aged surface. Fear, he murmurs, almost to himself, is an excellent catalyst for cardiac arrest, particularly in a man of advanced years. The body's response to extreme terror can be as lethal as any poison, as effective as any blade. Watson shifts forward in his chair, the medical professional in him engaged despite the story's supernatural overtones. You suggest, then, that Pemberton was literally frightened to death, that something appeared to him, something his rational mind could not reconcile, and the shock proved fatal. I suggest nothing yet, Holmes replies softly, though a slight smile touches his lips. I merely observe that the human heart is a fragile mechanism, subject to failures both mechanical and psychological. Whether Lord Pemberton died from natural causes exacerbated by anxiety, or from some more extraordinary intervention, remains to be determined. He sets down the parchment with careful reverence and moves to his desk, where he retrieves a magnifying glass and what appears to be a small leather-bound notebook filled with his characteristic, precise handwriting. Miss Ashford, I shall need to examine Lord Pemberton's residence, his study specifically. I presume it remains largely undisturbed since his death. Eleanor nods quickly. His nephew inherited the property, but has not yet taken possession. The house stands empty, maintained by a single housemaid who comes daily to ensure the pipes do not freeze, and the rooms remain aired. I can provide you the address, and I believe the nephew would grant permission for your investigation, particularly if we suggest it concerns his uncle's scholarly legacy. Excellent, Holmes says, already moving toward his bedroom, his voice carrying back to them. Watson, if you would be so kind as to telephone the nephew tonight, arrange access for tomorrow morning. Miss Ashford, you will remain here as our guest. Mrs. Hudson keeps a perfectly serviceable spare room, and I suspect you will rest easier knowing you are not alone with your knowledge. Watson rises, prepared to play his customary role as intermediary and arranger. But Eleanor speaks again, her voice urgent. There is something else, Mr. Holmes, something I have not yet mentioned. Holmes reappears in the doorway, already partially changed into heavier clothing, more suitable for potential nocturnal investigations. Yes, the parchment, Eleanor breathes. According to Pemberton's notes, it is not merely a map or record. He believed it to be a summoning document, a ritual text used by ancient peoples to call these creatures down from their mountain fastnesses. Whether for worship, negotiation, or some purpose we cannot fathom, he was uncertain. But he was convinced that possessing this document, studying it too closely, was itself a form of invocation. The room seems to contract around these words, the walls drawing closer, the shadows deepening. Even the fire appears to dim momentarily, as though some draught has passed through the sealed room, touching everything with invisible fingers of ice. Holmes's expression does not change, yet Watson perceives something in his friend's stillness, a quality of heightened alertness that speaks to genuine interest rather than dismissal. Then we must consider, Holmes says slowly, each word weighted with significance. that by bringing this document to Baker Street, you may have extended the invitation beyond yourself. Whatever follows this parchment may now consider all of us participants in its mystery. Before anyone can respond, a sound interrupts the tense atmosphere. Not the rattling wind this time, but something closer, more immediate. A distinct creaking from the stairs outside their rooms. The particular groan of old wood bearing weight. The sound ascends slowly, deliberately, one step and then another, accompanied by what might be breathing, or perhaps merely the building settling in the cold. Mrs. Hudson appears in the doorway, her comfortable figure wrapped in a thick shawl, her face apologetic. "Forgive the intrusion, gentlemen, miss, but I thought you should know. Something peculiar has occurred in the street below. The snow, you see, it has formed the most unusual pattern directly before our door." The four of them descend the narrow staircase together, Holmes leading with lamp held high, Watson close behind, Eleanor between them, and Mrs. Hudson bringing up the rear with her characteristic blend of curiosity and practical concern. The front door opens onto a blast of cold air that steals breath and brings tears to eyes, the snow falling now with renewed intensity, each flake fat and heavy with moisture. Holmes kneels at the threshold, holding the lamp low, and in its golden light, Watson perceives what has alarmed their landlady. The snow before their door has indeed formed an unusual pattern, or rather, something has disturbed it, creating impressions both massive and distinctly shaped. Footprints, if such a word can apply to marks so large, so deeply impressed into the accumulating white. Each print measures perhaps 18 inches in length, with 5 distinct toe impressions, the space between them suggesting a stride far exceeding human capability. The trail leads from the street directly to their door, then appears to circle the building's perimeter before vanishing into the general confusion of snow and shadow that characterizes London's winter night. Holmes produces a measuring tape from somewhere within his coat, taking careful notation of each dimension, his movements methodical despite the cold numbing his fingers. "Remarkable," he murmurs, and there is genuine fascination in his voice, the tone of a man confronting a puzzle worthy of his considerable abilities. The depth suggests significant weight, perhaps 300 pounds or more. The track pattern indicates bipedal locomotion, yet the stride length and distribution of pressure points are inconsistent with any human anatomy. See here, Watson, how the weight concentrates toward the ball of the foot rather than the heel. This suggests a creature accustomed to moving across snow and ice, distributing weight to prevent sinking. Watson finds himself both thrilled and unsettled by his friend's evident enthusiasm. "Then you believe Miss Ashford's story? You accept the possibility that something from the Himalayas has followed her to London?" Holmes rises, brushing snow from his knees, his grey eyes reflecting lamplight as he gazes up and down Baker Street's deserted length. "I believe evidence, Watson. I accept what my senses confirm, and what rational analysis cannot dismiss. Whether this evidence indicates a surviving member of an unknown species, or some extraordinarily elaborate hoax, remains to be determined. What I can confirm is that something quite large visited our doorstep tonight, something that left tracks unlike any in my considerable catalogue of London's fauna. They return indoors, bringing cold air and speculation with them, the fire seeming to burn more vigorously in welcome after their brief exposure to winter's bite. Mrs. Hudson bustles off to prepare the spare room, muttering about the strange events that follow Mr. Holmes, like stray cats following a fishmonger. Eleanor sinks back into her chair, looking somehow both vindicated and more frightened, as though having her story confirmed makes it more real, more inescapable. Holmes stands before the fire, warming his hands, his profile sharp and thoughtful. "We shall visit Pemberton's residence at first light," he announces quietly. "Whatever walked Baker Street tonight has made its interest in this matter abundantly clear. We must understand what Lord Pemberton discovered, what knowledge proved so dangerous that it may have cost him his life. Until then, we rest, we maintain vigilance, and we allow our minds to work upon the problem from that peculiar angle available only to consciousness suspended between waking and dreaming." Watson prepares the medical bag he keeps always ready, including certain items that might prove useful should the night bring further unexpected visitors. Eleanor accepts Mrs. Hudson's offer of hot milk and a warming pan for her bed, her hands still trembling slightly as she clutches the proffered cup. The building settles around them, creaking and sighing as old buildings do, each sound now carrying potential significance, each shadow requiring second examination. Outside, snow continues its patient work of transforming London into something cleaner, quieter, more mysterious than its daytime self. The tracks before Baker Street gradually fill and disappear, erased by nature's own hand, leaving only Holmes's careful measurements and sketches as evidence they ever existed at all. Morning arrives reluctantly over London, the sun hidden behind layers of grey cloud, the tun hidden behind layers of grey cloud that press down upon the city like a weight, turning daylight into something muted and uncertain. The snow has ceased its falling, leaving behind a transformed landscape where familiar streets, where unfamiliar contours, where ordinary buildings have become castles of white and ice. Baker Street wakes slowly to this altered world, shopkeepers emerging to shovel pathways, delivery carts proceeding with unusual caution along roads made treacherous by the night's accumulation. Within the sitting room at 221B, Holmes has apparently not slept at all. Watson discovers him precisely where he left him hours before, still positioned before the fire which has been carefully maintained throughout the dark hours, still studying Pemberton's parchment and journals with that absolute concentration that seems to remove him from ordinary time. The morning light, such as it is, filters through frost-painted windows, adding its pale contribution to the lamp and firelight that have sustained Holmes through his nocturnal research. "You have made discoveries," Watson observes, not quite a question, as he accepts the cup of coffee Mrs. Hudson has thoughtfully prepared, the steam rising in delicate spirals that catch and diffuse the weak morning light. Holmes glances up, and Watson notes the particular brightness in his grey eyes that indicates triumph, the successful navigation of some intellectual labyrinth. "Several discoveries," Holmes confirms, his voice carrying that musical quality it acquires when he has solved portions of a puzzle. "Come, see what Pemberton's journals reveal when one reads not merely the words, but the spaces between words, the hesitations, the careful omissions that speak more loudly than declarations." Watson settles beside his friend, cradling his coffee, allowing its warmth to seep into hands still cold from the winter morning. Holmes has arranged the journals chronologically across the floor, creating a timeline that spans decades of exploration and documentation. His long fingers move across the pages with reverence. indicating passages marked with small paper tabs. Pemberton's first expedition to the Himalayas occurred in 1879, as Miss Ashford indicated, Holmes explains softly, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecturer guiding students through complex material. But this was not his first encounter with stories of the Magoo. Look here, Watson, an earlier journal from 1867, when Pemberton was exploring the Canadian wilderness. He records hearing similar tales from indigenous peoples, stories of great white creatures that dwell in mountain ranges, that appear during the deepest snows, that possess intelligence and purpose beyond animal instinct. Watson leans closer, reading the faded handwriting, noting how Pemberton's script grows more urgent, more compressed, as the entries progress. He was tracking these stories across continents, building a case for their existence. More than that, Holmes murmurs. He was developing a theory, one that appears in fragments throughout these journals, never fully articulated, but consistently present. Pemberton believed these creatures were not merely undiscovered animals, but rather something that has existed alongside humanity for millennia, deliberately remaining hidden, maintaining boundaries between their world and ours. The fire shifts, a log collapsing into embers with a soft sigh, sending a wave of warmth across the room. Holmes rises to add fresh wood, his movements unconscious, automatic, his mind clearly elsewhere. He references numerous historical accounts, Holmes continues, descriptions from medieval texts of snow demons in alpine passes, Tibetan monastery records spanning centuries that speak of guardians of the high places, even Roman reports of strange encounters in the Carpathian Mountains during winter campaigns. Watson finds himself drawn into the narrative despite his natural skepticism, the accumulation of evidence creating a weight that cannot easily be dismissed. But surely, if such creatures existed, if they have been encountered repeatedly throughout history, we would have concrete proof. Specimens, bones, something beyond stories and shadows. Holmes returns to his chair, settling with that feline grace he possesses when comfortable in his element. But Pemberton addresses precisely that question. He theorizes that these beings possess sufficient intelligence to remove evidence of their own existence, to retrieve their dead, to avoid circumstances that would prove their reality to human science. And more, he suggests they have developed methods of communication, shall we say, with those who come too close to discovering their secrets. A soft knock interrupts their discussion, and Eleanor appears in the doorway, looking considerably more rested than when last they saw her, though dark circles beneath her eyes testify to troubled sleep despite Mrs. Hudson's comfortable accommodations. She wears a borrowed dress, Mrs. Hudson having provided necessities, and holds a cup of tea as though it were a talisman against uncertainty. "Good morning, Miss Ashford." Holmes greets her with unusual gentleness. "I trust you found some rest despite the circumstances." "I dreamed," Eleanor admits quietly, moving to warm herself by the fire. "Strange dreams of mountains I have never seen, of vast white expanses where the air is so thin each breath burns the lungs. And in those dreams I was being watched by eyes that reflected starlight, that held thoughts I could not begin to comprehend." Watson rises immediately, professional concern activating his medical instincts. Perhaps we should postpone this investigation, allow Miss Ashford more time to recover from her ordeal. But Eleanor shakes her head firmly, some steel entering her voice. "No, Dr. Watson. If anything, my dreams have strengthened my resolve. Whatever is happening, whatever Lord Pemberton discovered, it demands understanding. Ignorance will not protect us now. Holmes regards her with evident approval, a slight smile touching his angular features. Spoken with admirable courage, Miss Ashford. Very well, we shall proceed as planned. I have arranged for a carriage to convey us to Belgravia within the hour. Lord Pemberton's nephew has granted full access to the property, believing we are cataloguing his uncle's scholarly materials for potential museum acquisition. The journey across London unfolds like passage through a dream, painted in shades of white and grey. The carriage rocks gently over snow-packed streets, the horses' hooves muffled, the usual urban clamour reduced to distant murmurs and echoes. Holmes sits in contemplative silence, his grey eyes fixed upon the passing cityscape, while Watson and Eleanor maintain conversation about neutral topics, scholarly matters, and museum procedures. Anything to avoid dwelling upon the strangeness of their mission. Belgravia emerges gradually from the general whiteness, its elegant townhouses standing like sentinels of wealth and propriety, their facades perfect and austere. Lord Pemberton's residence occupies a corner position, allowing it slightly more grandeur than its neighbours. 4 stories of pale stone with tall windows that reflect the clouded sky like blind eyes. The housemaid who admits them is a woman of perhaps 50 years, her face lined with the particular weariness that comes from tending empty spaces once filled with life. She introduces herself as Mrs. Bramwell, her voice soft and respectful, as she leads them through entrance halls decorated with artifacts from Pemberton's travels. Masks from distant tribes, preserved specimens in glass cases, maps showing routes through territories most Londoners could not locate on a globe. His lordship's study remains precisely as he left it, Mrs. Bramwell explains, climbing stairs with the practiced efficiency of one who has traversed them countless times. The nephew instructed nothing should be disturbed until decisions could be made regarding the collection. Eye dust, of course, and maintain the fire on cold days to prevent damage. But otherwise, she trails off, a slight tremor in her voice, suggesting emotion carefully controlled. The study occupies the entire 3rd floor, a vast space where windows on 3 sides flood the room with light, making even the grey winter day seem luminous. Books line every wall from floor to ceiling, interrupted only by those windows, and by display cases containing objects, both beautiful and unsettling. Skulls of unknown origin, fossilized remains, photographs of landscapes so remote they might be from another planet entirely. Lord Pemberton's desk commands the room's centre, a massive construction of dark wood covered with papers, journals, and what appears to be correspondence in various stages of composition. Holmes approaches it with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a shrine, his keen eyes already cataloguing, analysing, constructing narratives from arrangement and disorder. Mrs. Bramwell, Holmes says gently, when you discovered Lord Pemberton, where precisely was he positioned? The housemaid moves to the desk's chair, her hand resting briefly on its high back. Seated here, sir, facing the window. His head rested upon his arms, as though he had laid it down for just a moment. I thought at first he was merely napping, you see. He often worked through the night, and would sometimes sleep at his desk rather than retire properly to bed. Watson circles the room slowly, noting details with his soldier's eye for terrain and position. The windows provide clear views of the street below, and the small private garden behind the property. now buried beneath pristine snow. No apparent point of entry for an intruder, no obvious disturbance or sign of struggle. Holmes has begun examining papers on the desk with minute attention, using his magnifying glass, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook. Eleanor approaches the display cases, drawn to a particular collection of photographs showing mountain landscapes, peaks so high they seem to touch the stars themselves. The afternoon light, such as it penetrates the heavy clouds, shifts subtly as time passes, shadows lengthening and deepening in the study's corners. Mrs. Bramwell has departed to prepare tea, her footsteps fading down the distant stairs, leaving the three investigators alone with the accumulated evidence of Lord Pemberton's obsessive quest. "Here," Holmes announces suddenly, his voice sharp with discovery. He holds up a letter, half written, the ink faded, as though the pen had been set down and never retrieved. "Listen to this. My dear Bartholomew, I write to warn you that my recent publications have attracted attention of a most unwelcome nature. I believe my correspondence is being monitored, my movements observed. Last night, I woke to find my study window open, despite having secured it myself, and upon the sill, pressed into frost that had formed on the interior glass, was a handprint. Not human, Bartholomew. The proportions were wrong, the finger length excessive, and there was a sixth digit where no sixth digit should exist." The letter ends there, incomplete, as though Pemberton had been interrupted mid-sentence by something that prevented his return to the task. Eleanor has gone very still beside the photographs, her face pale in the weak afternoon light. "Mr. Holmes," she whispers, and something in her voice brings both men immediately to her side. She points with a trembling finger to one photograph in particular, an image of a snowfield with a single set of tracks crossing its expanse. "Look at the scale marker Pemberton included. Look at the size of those prints. The tracks in the photograph are unmistakably similar to those that appeared outside Baker Street the previous night." Holmes takes the photograph with infinite care, Karenite care, carrying it to the window, where the weak afternoon light provides optimal examination. His magnifying glass moves across the image's surface with the precision of a jeweler appraising a rare gem, pausing at certain details, returning to reassess, constructing understanding from grain and shadow. Watson and Eleanor stand close, their breathing synchronized unconsciously. Three people united in the act of witnessing something that challenges comfortable assumptions about the world's nature and boundaries. The photograph itself possesses an eerie beauty. Pemberton clearly understood composition and light, capturing the moment when late afternoon sun broke through storm clouds to illuminate a vast snowfield, creating that peculiar luminescence unique to high altitudes, where air is thin and light travels unfiltered through atmosphere. The tracks cross diagonally through the frame, each print rendered with crystalline clarity, the displacement of snow creating shadows that emphasize depth and dimension. Eleanor has moved to examine other photographs in the collection, and now she makes a small sound, something between gasp and whimper. Holmes and Watson turn immediately to find her pointing at another image, this one considerably more disturbing than the first. The photograph shows what appears to be a cave entrance high on a mountain face, barely visible against the surrounding stone and ice. But it is not the cave itself that arrests attention. Rather, it is what stands partially visible within that darkness, caught by Pemberton's camera at the precise moment when whatever dwelt there chose to observe the observer. The shape is massive, white against deeper shadow, and though the image is blurred by movement or distance, certain features remain unmistakable. A face, if such a word applies, turned toward the camera. Eyes that reflect the flash of Pemberton's equipment, creating 2 points of light in the darkness, and surrounding those eyes, contours that suggest both human and animal characteristics, familiar enough to recognize as face, strange enough to trigger profound unease. Watson finds his medical training asserting itself, attempting to categorize what he sees according to known anatomy. The orbital spacing, he observes quietly, is wider than human, suggesting enhanced binocular vision adapted for depth perception in challenging terrain. The brow ridge appears pronounced, but the overall skull shape suggests significant cranial capacity. If this is genuine, if not merely tricks of shadow and wishful seeing, then we are looking at something that shares certain evolutionary characteristics with humanity while diverging in significant ways. Holmes has gone very still, a quality of absolute focus descending upon him that Watson recognizes as indicating his friend's complete intellectual engagement. Pemberton was not merely collecting folklore, Holmes says softly. He was documenting an unknown species, building scientific evidence for something that has successfully concealed itself from human knowledge for millennia. And somewhere in this process, he crossed a boundary, violated some principle or prohibition that these beings enforce with methods we are only beginning to comprehend. Mrs. Bramwell's footsteps announce her return before she appears, bearing a tray laden with tea service, the familiar ritual of afternoon refreshment seeming bizarrely normal amid such extraordinary revelations. She sets the tray upon a side table, her movements practiced and efficient. But Watson notices how her hands tremble slightly, how her gaze avoids the photographs and display cases, as though she has trained herself not to see what surrounds her in this strange museum of impossible things. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asks, directing her question to Holmes, while focusing her attention somewhere near his shoulder. "Mrs. Bramwell," Holmes says gently, "you were in Lord Pemberton's employ for many years, were you not?" 32 years, sir," she confirms, and pride briefly overcomes her nervousness. "Since his lordship first established this household, after returning from his inaugural expedition." Holmes moves closer, his manner conveying respect and genuine interest rather than interrogation. "Then you must have observed changes in his lordship over those decades, particularly, perhaps, in his final months." Mrs. Bramwell's composure wavers, her lower lip trembling before she catches it between her teeth. When she speaks, her voice has dropped to barely above a whisper, as though the walls themselves might carry tales she wishes to keep contained. "He grew frightened, sir. His lordship was the bravest gentleman I ever knew, faced dangers in distant lands that would terrify ordinary men, yet in those last weeks he became watchful, constantly checking windows, insisting doors remain locked even during daylight, starting at sounds that carried no threat. He stopped sleeping in his bedchamber, choosing instead to remain here in his study, where he could maintain vigilance." "Vigilance against what?" Watson asks softly. Mrs. Bramwell's eyes finally meet theirs, and in them Watson perceives genuine terror carefully controlled through years of service and propriety. "He never said directly, sir, but I heard him talking to himself, as the elderly sometimes do. He kept repeating that he should never have published his findings, that he had betrayed a trust he did not understand when accepting. He said they were coming, that they always came when their secrets were threatened. And he said, she pauses, struggling with whether to continue. Please, Eleanor urges gently, anything you remember might help us understand. He said they could cross distances that should require months in mere days, that they moved through winter storms as easily as we walk through summer gardens, that they possessed patience beyond human comprehension, and would wait, watch, until the precise moment when intervention became necessary. Mrs. Bramwell draws a shaking breath. The morning I found him, sir, the study was cold, bitter cold, though the fire had been burning strongly the night before, and should have maintained warmth for hours. And there was a smell, faint but distinct, like nothing I had encountered in all my years of service, wild and ancient, as though something from the world's beginning had passed through this room. The fire Holmes has been maintaining suddenly crackles loudly, startling them all, a log splitting and sending sparks dancing up the chimney. The sound breaks the spell of Mrs. Bramwell's testimony, and she steps back, professional demeanour reasserting itself. I should return to my duties, she murmurs, curtsying slightly, before retreating with visible relief toward the stairway. Holmes has returned to Pemberton's desk, pulling open drawers with careful thoroughness, examining contents with his characteristic attention to detail. Eleanor pours tea for Watson and herself, the familiar ritual providing comfort, the warmth of the cup a tangible anchor to normalcy amid gathering strangeness. Watson accepts gratefully, noting how the afternoon light has begun to fade, how shadows accumulate in the study's corners, like dark water pooling in low places. Holmes. Watson ventures after several minutes of silence, broken only by the rustle of papers and the soft settling of the fire. What do you make of all this? Surely there must be a rational explanation, some framework that accommodates these observations without requiring us to abandon scientific principles. Holmes straightens from his examination, holding what appears to be a leather journal distinct from the others, smaller and more worn, as though carried constantly rather than stored safely on shelves. The universe, Watson, operates according to laws we have only partially discovered. Science does not declare what can and cannot exist. It merely describes what we have thus far observed and measured. If Pemberton's evidence is genuine, and I am increasingly inclined to believe it is, then we are confronting not impossibility, but rather our own incomplete understanding. He opens the small journal, and even from a distance, Watson can see that its pages are filled with sketches, detailed anatomical drawings, executed with skill, suggesting genuine observation rather than imaginative speculation. Holmes's grey eyes move across these illustrations with growing intensity, occasionally glancing toward the photographs as though confirming correspondences between observed and documented. Pemberton was attempting to construct a comprehensive biological profile, Holmes explains, holding the journal so Watson and Eleanor can see. Look here, sketches of hands showing 6 digits as his letter mentioned, but note the detail. These are not crude drawings, but careful anatomical studies showing bone structure, muscle attachment points, the articulation of joints, and here skull studies from multiple angles, clearly drawn from direct observation or from specimens he somehow obtained. Eleanor leans close, her tea forgotten, scholarly interest overcoming fear. The cranial capacity is remarkable, she breathes. larger than human average, suggesting advanced cognitive function, and the structure of the jaw, the dental arrangement, indicates omnivorous diet, but adapted for processing food in cold environments. This is extraordinary documentation, if authentic. Holmes turns pages slowly, revealing more studies. Feet adapted for snow travel with natural snowshoe-like spreading of toes, eyes with reflective layers suggesting enhanced night vision, body proportions indicating strength far exceeding human norms. The final pages contain something different, not anatomical sketches, but rather what appear to be linguistic notations, attempts to transcribe sounds into phonetic symbols. He was trying to learn their language, Holmes says quietly, wonder touching his usually analytical tone, or at least to document vocalizations he observed. See how he notes that certain sounds exist outside human hearing range, requiring special notation to indicate frequencies we cannot naturally perceive. The daylight has nearly failed now, the study sinking into that peculiar twilight that precedes full darkness, when the world becomes uncertain, when familiar shapes acquire strange significance. Holmes moves to light the gas lamps, their warm glow pushing back shadows, but somehow making the room feel smaller, more enclosed, as though the walls have drawn closer during their investigations. Watson approaches one of the windows overlooking the street, drawn by movement glimpsed in peripheral vision. Below, Belgravia prepares for evening, lamps being lit in neighbouring houses. A few brave pedestrians hurrying through the cold toward warm destinations. But there, at the edge of the small park across the street, partially obscured by snow-laden trees, Watson perceives something that makes his heart accelerate, despite his attempts at rational calm. A figure stands motionless amid the trees, unusually tall, unusually broad, rendered indistinct by distance and failing light, yet somehow commanding attention through its very stillness. As Watson watches, the figure turns its head, a movement unmistakable, even at such remove, orienting toward Pemberton's house, toward the very window where Watson stands. "Holmes," Watson calls softly, urgency underlying his controlled tone. "I believe we are being observed." Holmes joins Watson at the window, with that economy of movement, that seems to fold space, arriving beside his friend without apparent haste, yet instantaneously present. Together, they stand in the lamp-lit study, gazing down into the gathering dusk, their breath creating faint clouds against the cold glass despite the room's warmth. The figure remains among the trees, a darker shadow amid shadows, its stillness so absolute it might be mistaken for a trick of twilight vision, for the mind's tendency to construct meaning from random patterns of light and dark. Yet Watson knows what he sees. His military experience, those years observing enemy positions and distinguishing genuine threats from nervous imagination, confirms the reality of that distant watcher. The proportions are wrong for human anatomy, the shoulders too broad, the head positioned at an angle suggesting neck structure, unlike any Watson has studied in his medical training. And there is something about its posture, a quality of patient attention, that communicates intelligence and purpose across the intervening distance. "How long has it been there?" Holmes murmurs, his voice barely disturbing the study's weighted quiet. "I cannot say with certainty," Watson admits. "Movement drew my eye, but it may have been observing considerably longer. The trees provide excellent concealment, and with the failing light, one would need to know where to look. Eleanor has risen from her examination of journals, drawn by the tension in both men's postures. She approaches the window with visible reluctance, as though each step requires conscious will to overcome instinct, urging retreat. When she finally stands between them, gazing down at the park, her sharp intake of breath confirms she too perceives what defies comfortable explanation. "It knows we are watching," she whispers, and indeed, the figure has shifted slightly, turning more fully toward their window, its attention now unmistakably focused upon the three forms silhouetted against the study's lamplight. Holmes reaches for the lamp nearest the window, his hand hovering over the gas valve. If we extinguish the lights, we remove our visibility while potentially improving our observation of what stands below. However, such action might also be interpreted as acknowledgement, as communication indicating we understand the nature of this surveillance. "And if we leave the lamps burning?" Watson asks, though he suspects he already knows his friend's answer. Then we continue as we have been, appearing to conduct innocent scholarly research, suggesting we attribute no significance to distant figures in public parks. Holmes's grey eyes remain fixed upon the watcher, his analytical mind clearly parsing possibilities, calculating probabilities, constructing strategies from insufficient data. Yet, I confess, Watson, I am deeply curious about what might transpire should we acknowledge openly what we have discovered. Knowledge pursued in darkness often remains incomplete. Sometimes, understanding requires direct engagement with mystery rather than careful observation from safe distance. Before either Watson or Eleanor can respond, the figure moves. Not retreating or advancing, but rather executing a gesture so deliberate it can only be intended as communication. It raises one arm, extending it fully toward the house, and holds that position for several seconds before lowering the limb with visible precision. The movement conveys neither threat nor greeting, but rather something closer to marking, to establishing recognition, as though cataloguing those who have entered Pemberton's investigation. Then, with suddenness that startles despite its inevitability, the figure turns and moves deeper into the park. Its gait is peculiar even at such distance, a loping stride that covers ground with efficiency, suggesting adaptation to terrain vastly different from London's manicured gardens. Within moments, it has vanished entirely into the darkness gathering beneath snow-heavy trees, leaving only the three witnesses and their racing thoughts. The silence that follows feels profound, as though the study itself requires time to process what has occurred. Holmes finally moves away from the window, returning to Pemberton's desk with renewed purpose, his movements now carrying urgency previously absent. "We must accelerate our research," he announces, already gathering journals and papers into organized stacks. "Whatever we witnessed has confirmed that our investigation has attracted notice, that we are now participants rather than merely observers. Time may be limited before circumstances change in ways we cannot predict." Watson finds his soldier's instincts awakening, the familiar mental state that accompanied dangerous missions where preparedness might mean survival. Should we request police presence? Establish some form of protection? "And tell them what, precisely?" Holmes asks, though his tone carries no mockery, merely acknowledgement of their predicament. "That we are being watched by something that defies conventional classification, that Lord Pemberton may have died from knowledge rather than natural causes, that we possess evidence of a species science insists cannot exist." No, Watson, we are beyond the reach of ordinary authorities. Whatever protection we require must come from understanding, from knowing what we face and why it manifests interest in our activities. Eleanor has returned to the photographs, studying them now with the intensity of someone seeking specific information rather than general documentation. Pemberton's journals mention locations, she says, her voice regaining scholarly steadiness. Specific sites where he observed or encountered these beings. Perhaps there is a pattern, some indication of where they concentrate their presence, what draws them to particular territories. Holmes looks up with approval, recognizing a mind adapting quickly to extraordinary circumstances. Excellent reasoning, Miss Ashford. Geography may indeed provide insights where other approaches falter. Help me construct a chronology of Pemberton's sightings and encounters. We shall map them, analyze the distribution, search for underlying logic that might illuminate motive and method. The three of them work in concentrated silence for what might be minutes or hours, time losing conventional meaning as they immerse themselves in Pemberton's accumulated evidence. The journals span decades, chronicle expeditions to mountain ranges across 4 continents, document encounters ranging from distant sightings to close observations to one remarkable account where Pemberton claims to have exchanged goods with a creature that approached his camp during a Himalayan storm. Watson reads this passage aloud, his voice soft in the lamplight study. It came to the fire's edge, where firelight met snow darkness, and placed upon the ground 3 items. A carved stone depicting symbols I could not decipher. A bundle of herbs unknown to my botanical knowledge, and a single feather from a bird I had never seen, despite years of ornithological study. In exchange, without prompting, I offered salt, steel needles, and a small mirror. The creature examined each item with careful attention before taking them and retreating beyond firelight's reach. I felt no threat during this exchange, only profound sense of ritual being observed, of trade practices older than recorded history being honoured. Trade. Holmes murmurs thoughtfully, adding this information to the pattern forming in his extraordinary mind. Not predation, not simple territoriality, but rather exchange. This suggests complex social structure, economic systems, perhaps even ethical frameworks governing interaction with human observers. Pemberton was not killed for trespassing, but for something more specific, for breaking terms he may not have fully understood when accepting them. Eleanor has spread maps across a clear section of floor, marking locations from Pemberton's journals with small pins, different colours indicating different types of encounters. The resulting pattern shows clear clustering in remote mountain regions, but also disturbing outliers, instances where sightings occurred at lower altitudes, occasionally even near populated areas during winter months when snow provided cover and cold kept humans indoors. Look at the temporal distribution, she points out, tracing connections between pins. Encounters increased during periods when Pemberton published his findings, when he presented papers to scientific societies, when his theories received wider attention. It is as though publication itself triggered response, as though they monitor human discourse and react when their secrets approach broader awareness. The fire requires attention, its flames diminishing as fuel is consumed, and Watson rises to add logs from the brass holder beside the hearth. The action provides brief respite from intensity, allows his hands something practical to do, while his mind struggles with implications of their discoveries. As he works, arranging logs for optimal burning, ensuring airflow that will sustain flames through the evening hours. He becomes aware of a sound barely audible beneath the fire's crackling voice. Scratching, faint but distinct, coming from above, from the ceiling or perhaps from the floor above the study. The sound is rhythmic, deliberate, the scraping of something hard against wood or plaster, moving with patience that suggests neither urgency nor uncertainty, but rather methodical exploration. Watson freezes, the poker still in his hand, his eyes meeting Holmes's across the room. His friend has heard it too, head tilted in that characteristic posture, indicating focused auditory attention. Eleanor stands motionless beside her maps, one hand pressed to her throat, her face pale in the lamplight. The scratching continues, tracing a path across the ceiling from east to west, pausing occasionally as though whatever causes it stops to listen, to sense, to determine whether its presence has been detected. Then it resumes, slower now, more careful, the sound suggesting not random movement but deliberate investigation, as though something above seeks entry, searches for weakness in barriers between outside and inside, between known and unknown. Holmes moves with absolute silence to stand directly beneath the sound source, gazing upward at plaster that reveals nothing, that maintains its innocent blankness, despite what transpires beyond its surface. He holds up one hand, requesting continued silence, his entire being focused upon interpreting the information carried by those faint, persistent scratches. The sound reaches the ceiling's western edge and stops. Complete silence descends, so profound that Watson becomes aware of his own heartbeat. Eleanor's quick breathing, the distant clock marking seconds with mechanical indifference. They wait. 3 people arrested mid-motion, wondering whether the presence has departed or merely paused in its explorations. Then comes a different sound, lower, deeper, resonating through the building's structure itself. A voice, if such a word applies to something that seems to bypass ears entirely and register directly in the chest, in the bones, in places where sound should not reach. Not words in any human language, but rather vocalization that carries meaning through tone and harmonic structure, through frequencies that make the gas flames shiver and the window glass hum in sympathetic vibration. The sound lasts perhaps 3 seconds, no more, yet in those seconds, Watson experiences something beyond his ability to articulate fully. Recognition without understanding, awareness of being addressed by intelligence that operates according to principles he has never encountered. And beneath the awe, beneath the fear, something unexpected, curiosity. Whatever speaks from beyond the ceiling does not threaten, but rather announces, establishes presence, perhaps even requests acknowledgement. The silence following that impossible vocalization, stretches like glass approaching its breaking point, fragile and crystalline, ready to shatter at the slightest disturbance. Holmes remains perfectly still beneath the ceiling where the sound originated, his grey eyes distant with that particular quality, indicating rapid calculation, his mind racing through possibilities faster than words could articulate. Watson finds his hand has tightened around the poker until his knuckles have gone white, though whether from fear or preparation for defence, he could not say with certainty. Eleanor breaks the spell first, her voice emerging as barely more than breath given shape. It spoke to us, not with language, but with something else, something older than words. Holmes nods slowly, lowering his gaze from the ceiling to meet their eyes with unusual gravity. Indeed, that was not animal vocalization, not the cry of beast or bird, but rather communication from intelligence attempting bridge across vast differences in physiology and perception. "We have been acknowledged, Miss Ashford. The question now becomes what manner of acknowledgement we have received, and what response, if any, is expected or appropriate." Before anyone can venture answer to this impossible question, Mrs. Bramwell appears at the study entrance, her face flushed from climbing stairs, her manner agitated in ways that overcome her usual careful composure. "Forgive me, sir," she addresses Holmes breathlessly, "but I thought you should know immediately. The snow in the back garden, sir, it has been disturbed. Great marks across the pristine surface, as though something massive moved through during these last hours. And the kitchen door, sir, which I secured myself after preparing tea, stands open to the night air." Watson moves first, soldier's instincts propelling him toward potential threat. But Holmes's hand upon his shoulder restrains with gentle firmness. "A moment, Watson. Consider what Mrs. Bramwell describes. If something wished to enter this house uninvited, do you truly believe a locked door would present obstacle? No, the opened door suggests not intrusion, but rather invitation, a demonstration that barriers we trust are ultimately permission rather than prevention." Holmes turns to Mrs. Bramwell with courteous attention. "You are certain the door was secured when you last descended?" "Absolutely certain, sir," she confirms, wringing her hands. "His lordship was most particular about security in his final months. I checked every lock twice before coming upstairs, as was my habit, developed to ease his worries." "Then we shall accept what is offered," Holmes announces, his decision made with characteristic swiftness once analysis is complete. "We shall examine the garden and its marks, observe what has been deliberately displayed for our attention. Watson, bring the lantern. Miss Ashford, you are welcome to join us, or to remain here in the study's warmth. This is not a request I make, merely an observation that choice exists." Eleanor's chin lifts with determination. Watson has come to recognize as her particular courage, the academic's resolve to pursue knowledge regardless of personal cost. "I have come this far, Mr. Holmes. I shall not retreat now when understanding may be within reach." They descend through the darkened house, their footsteps muffled by rich carpeting, the lantern casting liquid shadows that slide across walls adorned with Pemberton's collected artifacts. The masks seem to watch their passage with hollow eyes, the preserved specimens to press against their glass prisons. Though Watson knows these impressions are merely imagination amplified by tension, yet knowing and feeling remain distinct experiences, and his hand strays unconsciously to the service revolver he has carried since their investigation began. The kitchen stretches wide and stone-floored, designed for grand household entertaining, though now it sees only Mrs. Bramwell's solitary preparations. The door stands open as described, revealing a rectangle of darkness and cold where warmth and security should dwell. Beyond that threshold, snow glows faintly under starlight that has broken through the evening's cloud cover, turning the garden into a landscape both beautiful and alien. Familiar, London transformed into something that might exist at the world's edges where maps surrender to imagination. Holmes raises the lantern high, its light spilling into the garden, and what it reveals draws gasps, even from those prepared for strangeness. The tracks are unmistakable, pressed deep into snow that must be nearly 2 feet in accumulated depth. creating a trail that circles the entire garden perimeter before converging upon a single point near the centre. There, the snow has been deliberately cleared, swept aside to expose the frozen earth beneath, and upon that cleared space rests an object that glints metallically in the lantern's glow. They venture forth as a group, staying close. Watson slightly ahead with his military bearing creating unconscious vanguard, Holmes beside him with lantern raised, Eleanor behind with one hand resting lightly on Watson's shoulder, as though his solid presence provides anchor against unreality. The cold is shocking after the house's warmth, stealing breath and bringing tears that freeze upon lashes. But none suggest retreat until they have seen what awaits examination. The object proves to be a box, or rather something between box and sculpture, constructed from metal. Watson cannot immediately identify, its surface covered with the same intricate symbols that marked Pemberton's parchment. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, each line etched with precision, suggesting tools and techniques beyond Watson's mechanical knowledge. The box measures perhaps 8 inches along each edge, a perfect cube that seems to capture and reflect starlight in ways that make its surface appear to shift, to move, though Watson knows it remains absolutely still. Holmes kneels in the cleared space, setting the lantern carefully beside him, and reaches toward the box with hands that tremble slightly, the only outward sign of excitement usually concealed beneath his controlled exterior. "Do not touch it," Eleanor warns urgently, but Holmes shakes his head with gentle dismissal. "It was placed here for us to find, Miss Ashford, for us to take. Leaving it would constitute rejection of offered communication, and I am not yet prepared to close doors that have been so deliberately opened." His fingers close around the box, lift it, and immediately his expression shifts, eyebrows rising in surprise. Remarkably light, hollow perhaps, or constructed from materials possessing unusual properties of weight and density. He stands, cradling the box, and gestures toward the house with his free hand. We should return to the study's warmth. Whatever this contains, examining it requires light and comfort, and the ability to document what we discover. The journey back through the house feels longer than descent, as though the box's presence has altered spatial relationships, stretched distances, made familiar passages strange. Mrs. Bramwell has retreated to her quarters, her limit of strangeness apparently reached, and Watson cannot fault her for choosing the comfort of ignorance over the burden of witnessing what increasingly defies all ordinary frameworks of understanding. The study welcomes them with firelight and warmth, though these comforts feel thin now, inadequate against what presses close from beyond walls and ceiling. Holmes places the box upon Pemberton's desk, positioning it directly beneath the brightest lamp, and the three of them gather around as though it were altar or oracle, something demanding reverence and caution in equal measure. The symbols covering the box's surface seem to flow and recombine as Watson watches, though he knows this must be trick of lamplight, an exhausted perception rather than actual movement. Holmes produces his magnifying glass, examining the seams where 6 faces meet with minute attention, searching for mechanism or hinge, or any indication of how the box might be opened. "There," Eleanor breathes, pointing to a particular symbol on the box's upper surface. That matches one from Pemberton's parchment, the symbol he noted as appearing repeatedly in contexts suggesting offering or exchange. Holmes nods thoughtfully, his finger hovering over the indicated symbol without quite touching. If this is indeed communication rather than threat, if what we have received follows protocols Pemberton documented, then perhaps... He presses the symbol gently, and immediately the box responds, not opening in any conventional sense, but rather unfolding, its faces separating and reconfiguring with mechanical precision that produces soft clicking sounds, metal moving against metal with such perfect tolerance that no friction mars the motion. The transformation takes perhaps 5 seconds, petals of strange metal blooming outward to reveal the box's interior, and what rests within draws their collective breath in wonder. A sphere, perfectly round, approximately the size of a child's fist, composed of material that seems to contain light rather than reflect it, glowing with soft blue-white luminescence that pulses gently, rhythmically, like breathing or heartbeat. The light it casts transforms the study, banishing shadows while creating new ones, making every object appear both more solid and more ephemeral, as though reality itself has become negotiable. Beautiful, Eleanor whispers, and indeed the sphere possesses aesthetic qualities beyond mere function, craftsmanship that transforms utility into art. But it is Holmes's observation that captures the moment's true significance. It is a message, he says quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty, not written in language we can read, but encoded in form and light and harmonic resonance. Pemberton received similar objects, documented their properties across multiple journals. He believed they were attempts at communication, gifts offered in reciprocation for items he provided during encounters. But he never succeeded in decoding their meaning, never penetrated beyond recognition that meaning existed to understanding what that meaning conveyed. Watson finds himself mesmerized by the sphere's pulsing light, its rhythm gradually syncing with his own heartbeat in ways that should alarm, but instead induce strange calm, as though the object projects peace along with luminescence. What does it mean that we have received this? What response is expected? Holmes straightens slowly, his gaze moving from the sphere to the window, where darkness presses against glass, where something watches from distance they cannot determine. It means, Watson, that we have been invited to understand, to participate in communication that transcends language and conventional frameworks. Lord Pemberton received such invitations and ultimately died, whether from fear or from violating terms of exchange, we can only speculate. We now face similar choice: retreat to safety of ignorance, or proceed toward understanding, despite risks we cannot fully assess. The sphere's light pulses steadily, patient, neither demanding nor dismissing, simply existing as possibility, as offered bridge between worlds that have remained separate throughout human history. Outside, snow begins falling again, soft and persistent, covering tracks, erasing evidence, returning the garden to pristine whiteness, as though nothing extraordinary has occurred within its boundaries. Yet the sphere remains, glowing softly on Pemberton's desk, and with it remains the question that will determine all that follows. Will they accept what is offered, or will they, like so many before them, choose the comfortable prison of the known over the terrifying freedom of the unexplored? Holmes reaches into his waistcoat pocket, producing a small notebook and pencil, his movements deliberate as honey poured from a jar, and begins sketching the sphere with quick, precise strokes that capture not merely its form, but somehow the quality of its light, the rhythm of its pulsing. Watson watches his friend work, observing how Holmes's usual analytical detachment has given way to something approaching wonder, a softening around his eyes that suggests emotions rarely displayed. The sphere casts its gentle blue-white glow across the desk's surface, creating pools of luminescence that seem almost liquid, as though light itself has acquired substance and weight. Eleanor has returned to Pemberton's journals, spreading them across the floor in chronological sequence, searching for references to similar objects received during previous encounters. Her fingers move across pages with practiced efficiency, the scholar in her fully engaged despite exhaustion that shadows her features, despite the accumulated strangeness that would send most fleeing toward normalcy and daylight. She murmurs softly as she reads, half to herself, half to her companions, creating a gentle counterpoint to the fire's crackling and the scratch of Holmes's pencil against paper. "Here," she announces after several minutes of searching, her voice carrying quiet triumph. Pemberton describes receiving his first sphere during the 1879 expedition. He writes, "The object appeared at the edge of my camp at dawn, placed upon a flat stone I had used the previous evening for preparing food. No tracks approached or departed, though snow had fallen through the night and should have recorded any movement. The sphere's light neither warms nor cools to the touch, exists independent of any power source I can identify, and continues its rhythmic pulsing without diminishment, even after 3 weeks of constant observation." Watson moves to the window, drawn by instinct to check the street below, to ensure they remain unobserved, or at least to document any observation occurring. The snow falls thickly now, each flake visible in the gaslight's glow, creating a curtain that obscures detail, while suggesting movement everywhere, shapes that might be real or might be snow and shadow, conspiring to deceive exhausted perception. He sees nothing definite, no lurking figures among the trees, yet cannot shake the sensation of presence, of attention focused upon this house from multiple directions simultaneously. Pemberton attempted various experiments, Eleanor continues, her voice soft and measured, perfect for the deepening night. He exposed the sphere to extreme cold and heat, submerged it in water, buried it in earth, even dropped it from significant height onto stone. Nothing affected its function or appearance. The light continued its steady pulse. The surface remained unmarked. The object appeared utterly indifferent to physical forces that should have damaged or destroyed it. Holmes sets aside his sketch, apparently satisfied with capturing the sphere's essential characteristics, and leans close to examine the object itself with his magnifying glass. "The surface appears seamless," he observes quietly, "as though the entire sphere was grown or formed rather than assembled from components. And the light emanates from within, from the sphere's center, or perhaps from the material itself, rather than from any discrete source. Remarkable craftsmanship. Assuming craftsmanship is even the appropriate term for creation that may follow principles we have not yet discovered. The sphere's pulsing shifts subtly, the rhythm accelerating slightly, and all three notice simultaneously, their attention snapping to the object with heightened awareness. The change is minimal, barely perceptible, yet unmistakable to those who have been observing closely. The light brightens infinitesimally, the blue-white taking on faint golden undertones, and the quality of illumination changes, becoming warmer, more inviting, less alien. It responds to observation, Eleanor breathes, wonder colouring her words, or perhaps to proximity, to the presence of conscious attention. Pemberton noted similar behavior, but could never determine the mechanism or meaning. Watson finds himself drawn back to the desk, fascinated despite himself, his medical training insufficient to categorize what he witnesses, but providing frameworks for observation nonetheless. Could it be biological, he ventures? Some form of life rather than mechanism? The pulsing suggests living processes, and the responsiveness implies awareness of environment. The boundary between life and mechanism may be less distinct than our definitions suggest, Holmes replies thoughtfully, his grey eyes reflecting the sphere's glow until they seem to hold light of their own. Consider that we classify organisms based on characteristics we observe in Earth's current biosphere. But nothing in natural law requires life to manifest only through carbon chemistry and cellular structure. Perhaps what we observe represents life, but life that evolved under radically different conditions, that solved survival's challenges through methods we have never encountered. The clock strikes 10 with gentle chimes that seem to travel through honey rather than air, each note prolonged and softened by the study's peculiar atmosphere. Mrs. Hudson appears briefly with fresh tea and biscuits, her manner carefully neutral, as though delivering refreshments to gentlemen studying ancient manuscripts, rather than examining artifacts from impossible sources. She departs quickly, clearly preferring ignorance to knowledge that might disturb her ordered world. And Watson cannot fault this choice, even as he envies its simplicity. Eleanor pours tea for them all, the familiar ritual providing anchor to normalcy, the warmth of cup and steam a tangible comfort. Watson accepts gratefully, noting how the simple act of drinking tea, of tasting something ordinary and known, helps steady his racing thoughts, reminds him that Baker Street still exists, that London surrounds them with its millions of sleeping citizens pursuing ordinary dreams of ordinary lives. Pemberton's journals describe a progression, Eleanor says, returning to her reading while cradling her teacup. First encounters involved only observation from distance, mutual awareness without interaction. Then came the exchange of objects, gifts offered and accepted, according to protocols neither species fully understood, but both attempted to honor. Finally, in his most recent entries, Pemberton writes of something more, moments of what he calls communion, experiences where the boundary between his consciousness and theirs seemed to thin, where understanding passed without language, without symbols, through channels he could not identify or replicate intentionally. Holmes has produced a tuning fork from somewhere within the desk's drawers, one of Pemberton's tools apparently, and now strikes it against the desk's edge. The pure tone fills the study, hanging in air like visible presence, and the sphere responds immediately. Its pulsing synchronizes with the fork's vibration, the light brightening and dimming in perfect rhythm, creating visual echo of acoustic phenomenon. Fascinating, Holmes murmurs, allowing the tone to fade naturally, watching as the sphere gradually returns to its previous rhythm. It perceives sound, or perhaps more accurately, it perceives vibration, harmonic resonance, the fundamental frequencies underlying matter and energy. Communication through sound would make evolutionary sense for beings dwelling in environments where visual communication faces limitations from snow, storm, distance across vast mountain landscapes. Watson sets down his teacup carefully, the china making soft contact with saucer. And even this small sound draws response from the sphere, a minute brightening, as though acknowledging even the quietest disturbances in its acoustic environment. Then perhaps, Watson suggests slowly, working through implications, the vocalization we heard earlier, that impossible sound that seemed to bypass ears entirely, was not threat, but rather greeting, announcement of presence, the equivalent of knocking before entering. More than greeting, Holmes says, his voice taking on that quality indicating intuitive leap, connection made between disparate observations. Consider Pemberton's progression: observation, exchange, communion. What we heard was not merely announcement, but rather invitation, a request for response, for acknowledgement that would move us from passive observation to active participation in whatever protocol governs contact between our species and theirs. Eleanor has gone very still, her tea forgotten in her hands. Are you suggesting we should respond? That we should attempt communication using methods we barely understand, toward ends we cannot predict? Holmes meets her gaze steadily, his angular features softened by the sphere's gentle glow. I am suggesting that we have already entered communication simply by accepting what was offered, by examining rather than fleeing, by treating their gesture with seriousness and respect. It was clearly designed to convey. The question is not whether to communicate, but rather how to do so in ways that honor both scientific curiosity and appropriate caution, that seek understanding without presumption or harm. The sound comes from multiple directions, surrounding the house, neither threatening nor comforting, but rather simply present, as though the building has been encircled by choir performing piece in no human musical tradition. The harmonies are beautiful in alien fashion, making Watson's chest resonate with frequencies he feels more than hears, triggering responses in bone and tissue that bypass cognitive processing entirely. Holmes and Eleanor have risen, moving to different windows, triangulating the sound sources through gesture and glance. The sphere on the desk pulses faster now, its light brightening substantially, and Watson realizes it is responding to the external vocalizations, perhaps amplifying them, translating them into visual frequencies their human senses can more easily process. They are here, Eleanor whispers, and her voice carries no fear now, only awe. Multiple individuals surrounding us, singing or speaking, or whatever term applies to what we hear. This is not threat, Mr. Holmes. This is ceremony. This is formal contact, first meeting, conducted according to traditions older than human civilization. Holmes nods slowly, his hand resting against the cold window glass, as though he might feel through it the presence of those who sing beyond. And we must respond, he says quietly, not with words they cannot understand, not with gestures whose meaning might be misconstrued, but with the one universal language available to us. He crosses to the sphere, stands before it with something approaching reverence, and begins to hum. Not any melody Watson recognizes, but rather a simple sustained note, allowing his voice to find resonance with the sphere's pulsing rhythm, matching frequency to frequency as precisely as untrained human vocal cords allow. Sound becomes visible in that moment, or perhaps vision becomes auditory, the boundaries between senses dissolving as Holmes's sustained note joins the chorus. Sustained note joins the chorus surrounding the house. The sphere responds with intensity that transforms the study, its light no longer merely blue-white, but prismatic, fracturing into colors that have no names in human language, creating illumination that seems to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Watson feels the vibration in his sternum, in the hollow spaces of his skull, in the marrow of his bones, where sound should not penetrate, yet does, carrying meaning that bypasses language entirely to lodge directly in understanding. Eleanor has closed her eyes, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, though her expression suggests not sorrow, but rather overwhelming emotion of different character, recognition of something beautiful beyond her ability to articulate. Her lips move soundlessly, forming words, or perhaps merely responding to the harmonic frequencies that fill the room like water fills a vessel, touching every surface, every corner, transforming acoustic space into something sacred and strange. The singing from outside shifts, modulates, and Watson perceives intelligence in the change. Deliberate adjustment to incorporate Holmes's contribution, to weave his human voice into their inhuman chorus, until distinction between species becomes meaningless, until all that remains is sound itself. Communication stripped to its essential nature as vibration travelling through matter, connecting consciousness to consciousness across the vast distance of evolutionary divergence. Holmes sustains his note with remarkable control, his chest expanding and contracting with measured breathing, his grey eyes half closed in concentration, or perhaps in something approaching trance, that peculiar state where analytical mind surrenders to intuitive knowing. The sphere's light pulses in perfect synchronization with his vocalization, creating visual representation of invisible phenomenon, making the abstract tangible through luminescence that paints their faces in shifting hues. Minutes pass, or hours, or perhaps only seconds that stretch and expand like heated glass, time losing its tyrannical linearity to become something more fluid, more responsive to consciousness and intention. The external singing gradually diminishes, individual voices dropping away until only a single vocalist remains, its contribution deeper than the others, resonant with harmonics suggesting size and power beyond anything Watson's military experience has prepared him to confront. Then silence descends, not the absence of sound, but rather its opposite, a quietness so profound it possesses weight and texture, pressing against eardrums with palpable force. Holmes allows his note to fade naturally, his breath releasing in slow exhalation, and as sound departs, the sphere's frantic pulsing gentles, returning to its previous steady rhythm, though its light remains brighter than before, as though the exchange has energized it, fed it in ways that defy thermodynamic principles. Watson becomes aware of his own breathing, Eleanor's quiet sobs, the fire's soft crackling, ordinary sounds made extraordinary by contrast with the charged silence preceding them. He moves to Eleanor's side, offering his handkerchief with the automatic courtesy trained into him through decades of gentlemanly conduct, and she accepts with trembling hands, pressing fabric to her face as though to contain emotions threatening to overflow. "What just happened?" she whispers, her voice hoarse as though she has been screaming rather than merely witnessing. "What did we do?" Holmes turns from the sphere, his face showing rare uncertainty, vulnerability seldom revealed even to Watson. "We acknowledged them," he says slowly, working through understanding as he speaks. "We accepted invitation to communion that Pemberton documented, but never fully achieved. They sang, and I responded, and in that response, barriers began to dissolve. Not permanently, not completely, but sufficiently to demonstrate willingness, to show that humans can participate in exchange conducted through frequencies rather than words." A new sound interrupts this tentative explanation, soft but distinct, unmistakable in its significance. knocking at the study door, not the sharp rap of human knuckles, but rather something heavier, more deliberate, creating deep resonance in the wood itself. 3 knocks, spaced evenly, the rhythm matching precisely the sphere's pulsing, as though visitor and artifact coordinate their communication according to protocols invisible to human perception. Watson's hand moves instinctively toward his revolver, but Holmes raises one finger in gentle negation. No weapons, Watson. What comes now is test, determination of whether our willingness extends beyond acoustic acknowledgement to physical presence, to direct encounter with what has remained hidden throughout human history. He crosses to the door with steady stride, no hesitation marking his approach, and his hand closes around the brass knob with decisive firmness. The door swings inward, and cold air rushes into the study's warmth, bringing with it scent Watson recognizes from Eleanor's description, wild and ancient, glaciers and high storms, and places where human footsteps have never marked virgin snow. The figure standing in the doorway surpasses imagination, while simultaneously confirming every detail from Pemberton's documentation. Approximately 8 feet tall, shoulders so broad they nearly span the doorframe's width, covered in thick white fur that seems to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, creating appearance of being woven from moonlight and frost. The face is magnificent and terrible, features suggesting both ape and human, while being precisely neither, achieving synthesis that creates something entirely distinct from either ancestral line. But it is the eyes that arrest all other observation, demand complete attention despite countless other details worthy of study. Large as a child's fist, golden as honey held to sunlight, possessing depth that suggests consciousness vast and complex, aware not merely of immediate environment, but of time itself, of history and future implications of this moment, when 2 species finally meet, without barriers of distance or legend between them. The creature remains motionless in the doorway, and Watson realizes this stillness is courtesy, allowance of time for human observers to process what they witness, to move through initial shock toward acceptance, or at least toward reduced panic. The creature's chest rises and falls with breathing, visible movement demonstrating it is living being, rather than hallucination or shared delusion. And the breath that emerges creates visible clouds in the temperature differential between hallway and study. Holmes bows, slight incline of head and shoulders, gesture that conveys respect without subservience, acknowledgement without submission. The creature responds after momentary pause, mimicking the gesture with precision that speaks to observational capacity and perhaps to familiarity with human customs learned through centuries of hidden watching. "Please," Holmes says quietly, gesturing toward the study's interior. "Enter and be welcome. You honor us with your presence." The creature moves with surprising grace for its massive size, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe, its movements controlled and economical, suggesting complete body awareness developed through navigation of challenging mountain terrain. It advances several steps into the room before stopping, positioning itself where firelight and lamplight both reach, allowing clear observation while maintaining proximity to exit should circumstances require retreat. Eleanor has pressed herself against the bookshelf, her expression balanced between terror and fascination, scholarly interest warring with primal instinct, screaming that something this large, this powerful, represents threat regardless of peaceful intentions. Watson stands between her and the creature, protective positioning unconscious and automatic, though he has removed his hand from revolver, accepting Holmes's judgment that weapons would prove worse than useless in present circumstances. The sphere on Pemberton's desk blazes with sudden intensity, its light becoming almost painful in brightness, and the creature turns its attention fully upon the object, golden eyes reflecting blue-white luminescence until it appears to possess multiple pupils, compound vision seeing through spectrums invisible to human perception. The creature extends one hand, and Watson notes the 6 fingers Pemberton documented, the enlarged palm adapted for gripping ice and rock, the short fur covering even the knuckles and fingertips. The hand hovers above the sphere without touching, and in that space between flesh and artifact, something passes, some exchange of information or energy that creates visible distortion in air itself, heat shimmer appearing in cold room, probability waves collapsing into determined states. The sphere's pulsing synchronizes with the creature's breathing, its light modulating to match rhythms of inhale and exhale, creating unity between being and object that suggests relationship more intimate than human tool use typically achieves. Then the creature straightens, withdrawing its hand, and turns its attention to Holmes with focus that makes Watson's breath catch in his throat. Those golden eyes fix upon his friend with intensity, suggesting assessment occurring on multiple levels simultaneously. Evaluation of not merely physical characteristics, but something deeper, more essential. Consciousness itself, perhaps being measured against unknown standards. The creature's mouth opens, revealing teeth adapted for omnivorous diet, capable of processing both plant matter and flesh with equal efficiency, and from deep within its chest emerges sound that Watson feels before hearing. Subsonic frequencies that vibrate through floorboards and up through his skeleton before becoming audible as complex harmonic structure that carries unmistakable meaning despite containing no words from any human language. Holmes stands perfectly still during this vocalization, his entire being focused upon reception, upon understanding, and Watson watches his friend's face transform, eyes widening slightly, lips parting as though to speak, but producing no sound, attention turned completely inward, as though processing information, arriving through channels that bypass ears entirely to deposit knowledge directly into awareness. The vocalization continues for perhaps 30 seconds, shifting through harmonic progressions that suggest language structure, grammar conveyed through frequency relationships rather than word order, meaning encoded in ratios between tones rather than in arbitrary sound symbol associations. When silence returns, Holmes remains motionless for several heartbeats before drawing deep, shaking breath, his hand rising to press against his forehead as though containing sudden headache, or perhaps attempting to organize thoughts arriving too quickly for comfortable processing. "I understand," he whispers, his voice barely audible, and something in his tone makes Watson's heart contract with sympathetic response to whatever burden his friend has just assumed. "I understand what was violated, why Pemberton died, what you require from us to restore balance that was disrupted." The creature dips its massive head in acknowledgement, then produces small object from somewhere within its thick fur, holding it forth with gesture that cannot be mistaken as anything other than offering. The object is book, or something very like book, though constructed from materials Watson cannot identify, pages that seem woven from light and shadow rather than paper, binding that flows and reforms like living tissue. Holmes accepts the offering with both hands, cradling it with reverence usually reserved for sacred texts or irreplaceable manuscripts. The creature watches this acceptance, those golden eyes unreadable, yet somehow conveying approval, satisfaction that communication has achieved its intended purpose. Holmes stands motionless with the strange book cradled in his hands. In his hands, its pages seeming to breathe beneath his fingers, and in the firelight his face appears transformed, aged somehow, as though the knowledge transferred during that impossible vocalization has added years to his features, weight to his soul that cannot be measured on any scale. Watson watches his friend with growing concern, recognizing signs of burden assumed, of responsibility accepted that will forever alter the man who bears it. The creature remains present, patient, its massive form seeming to fill the study not through physical size alone, but through some quality of presence that makes the space feel both smaller and infinitely larger, as though the walls have become permeable, as though Baker Street now occupies multiple dimensions simultaneously. Its breathing creates rhythm that entrains Watson's own, his lungs falling into synchronization without conscious decision, and he wonders if this represents some form of communication, biological harmony, establishing trust where words remain inadequate. Eleanor has inched closer, her initial terror transforming gradually into something approaching wonder. The scholar in her recognizing opportunity, unprecedented in human history, the chance to observe and document what has remained hidden throughout countless generations. Her hands move unconsciously toward the notebook she carries always in her pocket, but she stops herself, perhaps understanding that some encounters transcend documentation, exist properly only in memory and lived experience rather than in captured record. They call themselves the keepers of boundaries, Holmes says at last, his voice carrying strange quality, as though he speaks from great distance, or perhaps from deep within himself, translating concepts for which English possesses insufficient vocabulary. Not boundaries of territory or property, but rather boundaries between knowledge and wisdom, between discovering what exists and understanding what should remain undiscovered for humanity's own protection and peace. The creature shifts slightly, a small movement that somehow conveys affirmation, acknowledgement that Holmes's translation, however imperfect, captures essential truth. The sphere on Pemberton's desk pulses steadily, its light now gentle and calm, as though the exchange has satisfied some requirement, fulfilled purpose that brought artifact and being together in this unlikely convergence. Holmes continues, his grey eyes distant, seeing things beyond the study's walls. They have existed alongside humanity since before we developed language sufficient to name them, dwelling in places we could not easily reach, maintaining watch over thresholds we approach repeatedly but have never successfully crossed. They are not animals, not in any sense we typically apply that term, but neither are they what we would call human. They are something other, something evolved along paths that diverged from our own millions of years ago, yet something that shares with us capacity for consciousness, for culture, for choice. Watson finds himself leaning forward despite himself, drawn into narrative emerging from his friend's lips like water from deep spring, pure and cold and essential. The fire crackles softly, a log settling, and even this small sound seems meaningful now, part of larger symphony playing throughout the room, throughout the winter night, throughout London sleeping unaware beneath its blanket of fresh snow. Lord Pemberton, Holmes says, and sorrow touches his words now. Regret for man he never met, yet feels connection to across the barrier of death, was offered privilege extended to very few humans throughout history. He was permitted observation, allowed to document what he saw, even granted objects like this sphere as tokens of trust established through years of careful, respectful interaction. But trust, once given, creates obligation. And Pemberton, in his enthusiasm to share discoveries with scientific community, to prove to skeptical colleagues that his claims possessed foundation in observable reality, violated terms of exchange he did not fully understand when accepting them. The creature makes a sound, low and deep, not quite mournful, but carrying unmistakable sense of loss, of opportunity missed, of potential forever unrealized. Watson realizes he is hearing grief, sorrow expressed in frequencies that bypass his ears to lodge directly in his chest, making his own heart ache in sympathy for tragedy that transcends species boundaries. He published too much, Eleanor whispers, understanding arriving as Holmes speaks. He revealed too much in his journals, his photographs, his specimens. He made them too visible, risked drawing attention that would transform them from legend into target, from mystery into resource, to be exploited or eliminated by human fear and greed. Holmes nods slowly, his hands tightening slightly on the book he holds. They came to him not in anger, but in sorrow, to retrieve what he had taken, to ask that he destroy his published work, recant his claims, return to the comfortable obscurity of dismissed eccentric rather than validated scientist. But Pemberton refused. His pride, his investment in years of research, his desire for recognition and vindication proved stronger than wisdom, and so they were forced to remove him, not through violence, but through truth, by showing him fully what his actions would ultimately cause, by revealing consequences his limited human perception could not independently envision. A teacup rattles suddenly on its saucer, the small sound sharp in the weighted quiet, and Watson realizes his hands are trembling, fatigue and emotion finally overwhelming the disciplined control that has sustained him through this impossible night. Eleanor moves to steady the cup, her touch gentle on his arm, and the small gesture of human comfort feels profound. Reminder that despite all strangeness surrounding them, they remain connected through shared humanity, through bonds that endure regardless of what mysteries the universe contains. They showed him the future, Holmes continues, his voice dropping to barely more than whisper. Not through prophecy or magic, but through extrapolation, through cognitive abilities that can process probability streams we can barely imagine. They showed him humanity discovering their existence in ways he had made inevitable through his careless revelations. They showed him expeditions mounted to capture or kill them, militaries seeking to weaponize them, scientists demanding specimens for dissection and study. They showed him his beloved keepers hunted to extinction, driven from their mountain fastnesses into oblivion, and they showed him that he, through his pride and foolishness, would be the catalyst for genocide. Watson closes his eyes, understanding now the expression Mrs. Bramwell described, the wideness about Pemberton's eyes suggesting he had witnessed something that surprised him profoundly in his final moment. Not surprise of fear, but surprise of comprehension, of finally understanding the magnitude of what he had risked through thoughtless action. His heart could not withstand the revelation, Holmes says simply. The knowledge of what he had almost caused, of catastrophe he had set in motion through vanity and short-sightedness proved too much for his aged constitution. He died not from attack, but from understanding, from bearing truth too heavy for single consciousness to contain. The creature extends its hand again, this time toward Holmes himself, and Watson tenses, prepared to intervene despite knowing such intervention would prove futile against being possessing such size and evident strength. But Holmes does not flinch, does not retreat. Instead, meeting the creature's gaze steadily, accepting whatever comes next with courage Watson has witnessed countless times, yet never ceases to admire. The massive hand settles gently on Holmes's shoulder, weight that should crush instead, conveying something closer to blessing, to acknowledgement of understanding achieved and responsibility accepted. The creature's voice emerges again, softer now, harmonics shifting toward frequencies that feel comforting rather than overwhelming, and Holmes's expression softens, tension easing from shoulders and jaw, as though burden has been partially lifted, shared rather than carried alone. When the creature withdraws its hand and speaks again, Holmes translates immediately, his voice gaining strength. They ask that we continue what Pemberton began, but with wisdom he lacked. We are to study what they have given us, to learn what can be safely learned, but never to publish, never to prove, never to remove them from realm of legend and mystery where they have dwelt safely for so long. We are to be keepers in our own way, guardians of secrets rather than revealers of truth, understanding that some knowledge serves humanity better when it remains uncertain, when it dwells in space between confirmed and dismissed, where wonder can flourish without consequences. Eleanor has begun to weep quietly, tears flowing freely now, and Watson understands these are not tears of sorrow, but rather of something more complex, relief and awe and recognition of having participated in something that will forever mark her life's significance, that will provide meaning and purpose beyond anything she might have imagined during her ordinary museum days, cataloguing ordinary human artifacts. The creature moves toward the door, its business concluded, communication achieved, terms established for relationship that will continue through years ahead, but always at distance, always with respect for boundaries that must remain inviolate. At the threshold it pauses, turning back one final time, and its golden eyes sweep across each of them in turn. Watson and Eleanor and Holmes, recording their faces, perhaps, or perhaps conveying some final message that requires no translation, that exists purely as moment of connection between consciousness and consciousness. Then it is gone, moving into the hallway with surprising silence for its size, descending stairs that do not creak beneath its weight, passing through kitchen and out into the garden, where snow continues its patient work of covering and concealing, erasing evidence that anything unusual has occurred this night. Watson crosses to the window, watching as massive form moves through the white landscape, joined by others emerging from shadows and trees. A group of perhaps 6 or 7 individuals converging and departing together, leaving tracks that will be filled by morning, that will become merely stories if noticed at all. Holmes has opened the book to its first page, and the material responds to his touch, symbols appearing and rearranging themselves as though the text writes itself in response to the reader's presence. This will take years to fully comprehend, he murmurs, wonder and anticipation both present in his tone. Perhaps a lifetime, perhaps multiple lifetimes. But we have been given gift beyond price, Watson. We have been trusted. Eleanor joins them at the window, watching the last of the keepers disappear into the snow-shrouded darkness, and her face holds expression of profound peace, as though some question long troubling her soul has finally received answer. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" she asks softly. "Do you think we should even try to make them believe?" "No," Holmes replies immediately, definitively. "That is precisely what we must not do. We will continue our ordinary work, investigate ordinary mysteries, maintain our ordinary lives. But within those ordinary days, we will carry extraordinary knowledge. We will study what we have been given, and we will honor the trust placed in us by beings who chose to reveal themselves rather than remain forever hidden. That is our responsibility now. That is our burden and our privilege." The first light of Christmas morning begins to touch the eastern horizon, pale pink and gold that promises clear day after the night's snow. And London begins its slow awakening, unaware that within its boundaries contact has been made. Bridge has been built between species that have dwelt separately since time before memory. Church bells begin their Christmas call, joyful and pure, and the sound seems to carry blessing, to sanctify what has occurred, to welcome mystery into the world, rather than driving it away through insistence that only the proven and the known deserve acknowledgement. Mrs. Hudson appears with Christmas breakfast, seeming unsurprised to find them all awake, and if she notices the strange book or the sphere still glowing softly on the desk, she gives no indication, simply setting out food and wishing them peaceful holiday before withdrawing to her own celebrations. The ordinary rhythm of life reasserts itself, but transformed, made sacred through recognition that beneath the ordinary flows extraordinary currents, that wonder persists in world that claims to have mapped and measured everything worth knowing. Watson watches his friend cradle the mysterious book, sees Eleanor make notes in her journal with trembling hands, and feels profound gratitude for whatever chance or fate brought him to this moment, to this place, to this impossible Christmas, when the boundaries of the known expanded just enough to accommodate mystery without destroying it, to honor magic without demanding it submit to measurement and dissection. If you have journeyed with us through this long night, dear listener, if you have stayed until this moment when mystery finds its resolution not in answers, but in acceptance, in understanding that some things are meant to remain partly hidden, partly known, dwelling forever in that liminal space where imagination and reality dance together, then perhaps you will honor us by subscribing to this channel, by leaving a like if this story has brought you comfort or wonder, so that others might find their way to these tales of the strange and the beautiful, the impossible and the true. Sleep now, gentle soul, and let your dreams carry you to high mountains, where the air is thin and the snow falls eternally, where beings dwell that we have named but never truly known, that watch and wait and remember that once, on a Christmas Eve in London, humans chose wisdom over proof, mystery over certainty, wonder over conquest. May your rest be deep and peaceful. May your dreams be filled with beauty. And may you wake refreshed, carrying somewhere within you the knowledge that the world remains larger and stranger and more magical than any of us can fully comprehend. Good night, dear friend, and may the boundaries you encounter in life be crossed with respect, with wisdom, and with the understanding that some doors are meant to remain only partly open, some mysteries are meant to endure. Farewell.